Good morning, everyone. This is the Universum team, and welcome to our latest webinar, which is looking specifically this time at subjects that are interesting around the newer piece of research that we've done this year, which is the UK professional research. This is our research that we do that asks all sorts of insights around the needs and drivers of UK professional talent and what it is they're looking for from their employers, from their career in the year that we exist in, the year we're operating in. So, quick intro, Carolina and Dennis, my colleagues at Universum, say hi.
Hey, everyone.
And we'll walk through some of the content here. If you've got any questions, please do shout. But this is what we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at three key trends right now that are both essential and important in our lives at the moment and our career and our work, but also that we've got some really interesting insights from the professional research to support. The first one being around the big matter of the Great Resignation and the importance of trust in this. We're going to look at a little bit of some evidence that demonstrates around some of the trust elements that we're looking for in this. The social brand effect, how brands like Facebook, very much in the news at the moment, how their reputation might be drifting and how it's affecting their employer brand. So we'll have a look at the correlation between big tech and employer brands. And we're going to look at sustainability. COP26 has obviously just been finished, the big UN climate conference, and we will also therefore be having a little look at how that's impacting talent choices, that subject area, particularly in the area of tech as well, as we're seeing some shifts in the needs and drivers of people within that industry. Just quickly, an introduction to Universum. We're the world's leading employer branding agency from a data and insights-driven perspective. That means we use deep insights from talent all around the world in over 40 countries in the world to help us understand and build the best and most targeted employer brand, EVP, and communication strategy to talent. And then we obviously use that same data set to ensure razor-sharp focus with regards to creation, content creation, and targeted messaging through social media and employer brand activation. So that's what we do. We're part of the Stepstone Group. As you can see, we're attached to Totaljobs here in the UK and many number of brands across the globe. And there's a number of our clients at the bottom. There's the countries we do research in the world. So as you can see, for those of you who are in international presence, we cover quite a lot of your existence. It usually turns out, even Kazakhstan. And you'll see today as well, we'll measure a lot of our research on some drivers, on what we call the Universum 40 drivers of employer attractiveness, which is our benchmarking tool that's used by many of the biggest brands around the world to measure their success of their EVP, their employer brand, etc., and what their perception is. We're going to use this a lot. This is where it comes from. It's a seriously robust and super deep methodology of measuring employer brand. So you'll see some of these come up later. This is the source of it if you wanted to get some context on that. So let's look at some of the trends from the research and we'll go through. So the first thing we wanted to look at was, is the trust the tipping point of the Great Resignation? Now, the Great Resignation has been something that has been very prominent this year, of course, something we've got very familiar with in the press, etc. And our data demonstrates actually we saw a little bit of this sort of coming in a sense. This is us breaking down the Universum professional talent research from 2020 and into 2021, showing the difference in the propensity to want to move from their employer in the next 6 months in orange and the next 12 months in blue. And as you can see, in the summer and autumn of last year, there was always a degree of propensity to move when asked the question. But as you can see, as we went into the second quarter onwards of this year, there was all of a sudden a spike forward that more and more people wanted to consider leaving their employer during the course of the next 6 or 12 months. In fact, 54% of people wanted to move within 12 months. It's quite staggering and quite something. And it was all there, and it was totally coincides with where we started to hear or feel the impact of the Great Resignation as we've started to go back into the workplace a little bit. And that was what really the press focused on so much, was the remote working element. Was it Is it the remote work element that is driving the Great Resignation? Are people just unhappy about having to go back to the workplace? Well, we don't think. Our research tells us there's a lot more than that to this. There's a lot of research around the challenges of also working from home that we've identified in other webinars that suggests it isn't just about remote working. It's more about how we made them feel. And therefore, we also move into a zone of thinking about, what does that mean? What does it mean when a company doesn't necessarily make us feel great about the move back into normal working environment? So we started to look at a number of factors, and passing to Carolina, here's one thing we looked at here was from the Edelman Trust Barometer. So over to you, Carolina, to explain what we see here.
Yes, so what we wanted to explore was trying to understand some of the underlying reasons why people feel like they want to leave their employer, right? And what is the reason that they almost feel like they've been betrayed by their employer, right? Because that's the kind of message that we get sometimes. So looking at some research that was done by the Edelman Group earlier this year and published in their Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a report they publish each year where they survey thousands of people across, I think it's 27 markets, we can actually see some really, really interesting data. And actually companies have, for the first time, overtaken both governments, NGOs, and other types of media outlets as the most trusted source of information and just trusted institution, basically. And if you take a step back and think about what has happened over the past 18 months, we've gone through a pretty rough period. I mean, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic have left governments attempting to navigate the effects and trying to decide on whether to lock down or lock up or impose restrictions or not. And that hasn't been easy. And if we look across the Atlantic, right, and look into the American election, we had the storming of the Capitolium last year and the alleged stolen election, which also impacts general trust levels amongst people when it comes to the government, right? And here in the UK, we have Brexit and everything that has come from that, right? So for a lot of people, the company and the organization have pretty much been the only consistent factor in many people's lives. And when companies are shifting the narrative too quickly, it might result in people feeling actually betrayed and feeling so strongly about it to the point that they want to leave, right? And what is important, or what is interesting, is that it's not only the companies themselves that are increasing influence. Around 65 to 70% of the respondents actually considered or wanted the business leaders to step in and fill the void that the governments effectively have led, right? And that's where we're seeing people like Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or Jack Ma have so much influence in matters that perhaps doesn't really resonate with their actual organization, right? So I think that's really, really interesting and something new. Dennis, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I know, when it's always fascinating looking at statistics, right? But when we, prior to this, discussed what are some of the cases we've seen where business leaders or CEOs actually step in from a moral standpoint, one thing that really resonated with us was the Salesforce example, where they established a new HQ in Texas, and then Texas decided to launch some not that good or not well received abortion laws for women, and then they went out and said, we're going to help you relocate. We're going to help our sales force and workforce relocate to ensure that you don't have to be a victim or suffer because of these dodgy laws. So I think that's a great example in terms of how the government is lagging behind in certain aspects, and companies then have that moral obligation to actually step in and care for their people, which again is a extension of what's happened because of COVID, but also something that we saw a bit before COVID, I would argue.
Yeah, and I think as we saw during COVID as well, they were the barometer. Businesses were the barometer because they needed to set rules pretty quickly as to what needed to be done. We needed direction. We needed to know where we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. And it became parents to us in a sense, in the way in which we looked after. And when you create that parentage and that close sort of bond for a period, when it shifts slightly, when that responsibility kind of drifts in any kind of way, as it maybe has started to done this year, as that care package and that support and parental package effectively kind of drops away a little bit and goes back into, hey, look, we need to be back to work, everyone, back to normality. Thanks, we've had the really nice cozy year where we've looked after you, but now we've got profitability to think about. Yeah, naturally there's going to be a little bit of disappointment that comes from that we're going to feel a little bit betrayed and a little bit kind of the trust will have dropped.
I think to your point, Steve, that would be even more applicable, at least from what I've heard from empirical data, speaking to some of the clients we have within the graduate population, because the last year of uni, they've been really taken care of, spoon-fed almost. They join a company, they're getting so well taken care of, etc. But now we're reaching that point where ambiguity comes in again, uncertainty. You're here to deliver. We expect you to perform, and all of a sudden that, the 18 months you've had, it's completely different now. And there's demands, requirements, etc.
Absolutely. So a thing that we looked at, just looking a little bit deeper into our research a little bit, there's 3 questions that we asked that Caroline will focus on a couple of these a little bit later as well from another angle. But one of the 3 areas we ask in the research is we ask the statements, we ask for the response to the statements. I trust in my organization's vision, I trust in my organization's leaders, and I feel I'm trusted to do my job. And what we can see here is in every organization, over that same period we looked at a short while ago, there are always your diehards, the people who are comfortable and at home and feel secure inside the business. And when asked, do they trust in their company's vision, etc., leaders, pretty good responses. And even during pandemic through to the post-lockdown periods, pretty consistent level of trust with the organization and the people involved in the organization. So on the whole, 1 in 3, and obviously in the field I'm trusted to do my job part, 1 in 2 quite comfortably, and maintaining it as such. But where it starts to become a little bit more fractious is in the tipping point, the area where people are a little bit more on the fence. Yeah, I somewhat trust in my organization. Yeah, I'm somewhat trusting my leaders. And in some ways, I feel trusted to do my job. We're starting to see a shift in this, whereas we had quite confidence levels in the period of last year. As we go into this and then into that subsequent period, we can start to see that those trust levels are dropping from 41 to 36 at the top and 44 to 38 in the middle and 37 to 31 in the sense that I'm trusted to do my job. And even there, just looking at that bottom layer, that's a big stark difference. The people who say they're complete and somewhat, quite a big difference in the people who feel as though they are trusted to do their job. And then when we look at the other end as well, the absolutely no options, which are somewhat no and completely no, they are also increasing. So what we're seeing is more and more dissatisfaction at far ends, of course, but there's a middle ground. There's the middle ground that we probably think we feel quite comfortable with our people, but actually the signs are that they're not as trusting of their organizations as maybe they were a year or 18 months ago or 2 years ago. Something to look out for. Don't always believe everybody. Yes, sometimes, yes, somewhat is definitely an indication of yes, probably no. So we need to, in the current environment, and we need to be aware of that. Here's something else interesting, Carolina.
Yeah, so what we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into as well are the main underlying reasons why people are leaving, right? And what you can see here is a matrix that's been put together by McKinsey, so it's based on research done by McKinsey, basically. And what we can see is a combination of factors that are important for employees, which you can see on the vertical line here, and then factors that are important for employers, which is on the horizontal line. And what we can see are the blue boxes here are basically areas where the employees find, or where the employees value it more than what employers do. And we can see it's all around the more purpose-driven elements. We see it's the sense of feeling valued both by the manager but also by the employer, having that sense of community and that sense of belonging, right? And if you compare that to what the employers think is the main reason why people are actually leaving, it's more around not having competitive base salary or not having access to the newest technology. So there's a huge discrepancy here and a huge divide in terms of what is the actual reason between why people leave and why companies think that we leave, right? And if we look into our Universum data and contrast and compare that data, we can actually see a quite strong correlation. So what you can see here are the top 10 most attractive attributes amongst British professionals in 2020 and in 2021, right? And what we can see is across both years, we can see in general, British talent tend to be quite motivated by things like professional training and development, career development, compensation, of course, but there's been some quite interesting trends that I wanted to point out. And the first one is that over these past 18 months, of course, there's been an increased need for that sense of security, of job stability, of having an employer who you feel you can kind of weather out this storm in. And also, as you can see, leaders who will support my development is something that entered the top 10 for the first time ever. And this doesn't really come as a surprise. I mean, when things get tough, people tend to look for organizations that can offer security and stability. It's also something that we saw back in the financial crisis in 08, 09, so something we kind of expected. The second trend that we're seeing is that flexible working conditions have actually dropped out of the top 10. And that doesn't necessarily say that it's not important anymore. It's just that it's no longer a competitive advantage. It's something that a lot of companies have to offer their employees to one degree or another, right? And it's something that employees are expecting from their employers to offer as well. So what I think will be more important moving forward for companies to focus on is more around the question around work-life balance. How do we make sure that people feel comfortable at the end of the day to close the computer and not worry about, should I answer emails at 9 p.m. in the evening or not? And then the final trend, which I think perhaps is the most interesting one, is the increase of importance of the more purpose-driven attributes. So here we can see it represented by respect for its people have actually increased from position 10 to 9, right? And what this is an indication of is that people are no longer only settling for companies that offer them career development and salary and work-life balance, but they also want an employer whose values that they feel that they can align behind and who they can support, and a company they can feel proud about working for, right? And this becomes even more evident if we look into the next slide, where we look at the attributes beyond the top 10, right? And here we can see the attributes that have gained and decreased the most in attractiveness over the past 18 months. And if we look into the left part here, we can see these are the 10 attributes that have gained the most in importance over the past 18 months. And it's all around, actually 6 out of these 10 attributes are all around the more purpose-related pieces. It's inspiring leadership, support for gender equality, CSR, respect for people, team-oriented work, and commitment to D&I, right? Which is a very strong indication of this more purpose-related movement that we're seeing. And on the flip side, the attributes that tend to be losing a little bit in attractiveness is more centered around prestige, compensation, also the flexible working conditions, and then innovation is there as well. So it's almost like as a shift in terms of what people are looking for, and it's no longer only these very strong competitive salary packages and career development opportunities that allure people anymore. You need to offer something greater than that as well, something more meaningful. Does that agree with what you've heard, Dennis and Steve, in your conversations?
Yeah, I definitely. And I think the lazy analysis that we sometimes come across is that, well, secure employment increased the most because it's uncertain in the job market, or at least early in COVID. So as if we're a stable employer, offer a competitive base salary, they'll join us because that's what happened in 08 to 2010. But clearly, when comparing the drivers back then with what decreased over the course of the financial crisis versus what has decreased this year, it's radically different. I mean, we're seeing, to your point, Carolina, inspiring leadership, support for gender equality, respect for its people, even commitment to D&I. It was unheard of 10 years back that these were the things that increased in a financial crisis. It was not even close. Instead, back then, we saw financial strength, market success, etc. Those drivers really climbed, whilst a friendly work environment, etc., decreased year on year. So it's a completely different time cohort in the sense that they value completely different things in comparison to 10 years back.
Yeah. And there's also, I can imagine some people on the call watching this thinking, hang on, we've just been talking about the Great Resignation and the people and their high willingness to leave their employer, yet secure employment is the biggest moving positivity. Surely there's an oxymoron there. We're leaving employers, therefore losing our security to go into other environments. But this is what this is telling us, is what people are aspiring to find from an employer. And therefore, they're leaving organizations because they're clearly not seeing these things in their employer, these attributes. And this what's brilliant about this particular slide and how it's so essential to our thinking is it guides us directly in thinking about how do we understand what we need to emphasize if we're to win this talent battle that exists right now. What are the things that people care about and are looking for? And that is the opportunity with this. This is just a very surface level one because it covers all talent. I mean, we'd always recommend to go a little bit deeper and look at your specific target groups and make sure that they're differentiated accordingly. But as an overall commentary, there is definitely a shift. Not necessarily security of employment doesn't mean dropping. It isn't about the fact that they don't want to drop their employer. They were happy to go and find a place where they feel secure and, as to our discussion point, trusted, that they feel at home and where they belong. Because security isn't just having a job that pays well and ensures they've still got a job next year. It's about how they feel inside that organization. So some of those factors that make them feel great are in those 6 blocks that are demonstrated there.
100% right. And I think just to add that real quick, some of the research that was done by McKinsey as well showcased that people choose to leave their employer without having a new job in hand, which once again just reiterates that people are leaving not because of pull factors, but because of push factors that exist in the organization. They don't feel secure, they don't feel stable, or they don't feel like they believe in the values of the organization, and hence they leave. And that kind of feeds us into the next piece here quite nicely, because what we wanted to see was whether trust or employee loyalty actually impacted or actually to some degree impacted whether people choose to stay within the organization or not, right? So whether you have that trust in the organization's vision and the leadership, would that impact your ability or your desire to leave their employer or not? So what we have is 2 sets of data. We have the green level here at the top, which showcases that people have no desire at all to leave their employer within the next 4 years, and then the orange box below, which are the people who showed or displayed some kind of indication that they wanted to change employer within the next 12 months. And we asked them about whether they felt that they could trust in the vision of their organization, right? And what we can see is that out of the people who had no desire to leave, only 8% of those respondents actually said that they're either neutral, they disagree with the vision of the organization, compared to the people who wanted to leave. Almost 30% of them actually didn't agree with the vision of the organization. So hence we can see a quite clear correlation there. And also if we bring this further and look into whether the respondents trust in the leadership of the organization, we see a very, very similar pattern there. Out of the people who choose not to want to leave their employer within the next 4 years, we can see only 10% of them didn't trust or have faith in their leadership, right? Compared to almost 33% of the people who showed that, who wanted to leave their employer. Basically, they didn't have that trust and respect for the leaders. So I think that's a quite clear correlation. But trust, of course, it doesn't only go one way, it goes both ways. It's not only about whether I believe and trust in the leadership and the vision of my organization. It's also about whether I feel like the organization trusts in my abilities, right? So we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this. So first of all, we wanted to investigate whether having the right skill set in any way affected my decision to leave an employer or not. And what you can see here, it's actually whether you wanted to leave or not didn't really impact, or whether you had the skills or not didn't really impact whether you wanted to leave the employer or not. So having the right skill set wasn't really a defining factor. However, when we asked about whether the respondents felt like the organization trusted in their abilities to achieve on their objectives or not, we can see a quite clear difference between the people who choose to stay with an organization and people who wanted to leave. So 71% felt that their organization had full confidence in their ability to execute on their tasks, whereas only 52% of the people who wanted to leave felt that their organization trusted them to do their things, which once again showcases that trust is a two-way thing. It's really, really important for companies to actively communicate on that vision where they want, but also for companies to listen to their employees and showcase to them that, hey, you know what, we trust in you. We have full faith in what you're doing, and having that open set of communication, basically.
Yeah, very relevant in a remote environment where we are doing our work on our own, and sometimes we're not being recognized as easily for it. It's very easy for that disconnect to happen between recognition and the work that we do. We end up therefore doing the work in a very lonely space without that recognition, and that's where that feeling of I don't feel my organization trusts me naturally start to come from, because the recognition factor is so much harder remotely, or we're not as well trained to communicate that recognition from a remote environment, and I can understand how this happens.
And I just add to that, I think it goes into pre-COVID micromanaging. If there's a lack of trust, you'll be monitored, etc. Yeah. And we even saw reports come out early in the pandemic where companies were monitoring the email activity, the screen activity of employees. I mean, what kind of message does that send? And I think a powerful quote on this is, work is a thing you do, not a place you go. So being able to be trusted to work from home, etc., because it's your competence, not your actual location, is something to bear with us now we are seeing organizations move back into the office in some type of hybrid model. But I think really listening to your workforce, trusting them to do their job properly will be the right way to go.
Spot on. So look, let's move into the second subject. I love the trust thing. That was super, super interesting. And then moving into another area, actually, in our second subject around sort of feelings of trust. And what we want to look at a little bit here is the challenges of big tech. We saw a bit of a trend in our research this year, and it's maybe been a bit of a micro trend before, but certainly was more evident this year, that some of the big tech organizations, whilst not necessarily all dropping a ranking, we're definitely starting to lose a little bit of their market share of appreciation this year, traditionally large employers. And given the recent news, we wanted just to briefly focus on Facebook as one of those examples of one of those companies that has faced a little bit of a challenge when we look at the Universum rankings list over the last few years. For a company like Facebook, it's very hard from a talent attraction perspective. When we see here from a simple terms, we kind of go, oh, look at their ranking. This is their perception in the US and the UK. And it's dropping heavily, particularly in non-tech roles, in more broader commercial roles. Quite a significant drop during the course of the year. And there are sometimes reasons why employer brands teams can understand why this happened. But of course, a lot of this is very little to do with employer brand or talent acquisition or talent attraction. It's very much to do with the things that are part of our everyday life, because companies like Facebook and big tech organizations, particularly in the social media sphere, are in our everyday lives and right center and front in the news and in activity, and are out there to be targeted as well by the media and by the society as whole as easy pickings effectively. And this really creates a challenge with regard to recognition from a talent attraction perspective, because clearly people will therefore start to vote with their feet. And there's an enormous amount of sympathy and empathy on our part that challenge exists. We've got there's not a lot that the tech companies can really do about this from an employer brand perspective. But we want to focus on a couple of things that maybe might help this out a little bit. Excuse me. And this is something here that well, Carolina, I mean, feel free to walk through if you like, because this is something you found when we looked at the kind of like the strongest associations and the weakest associations with these kind of tech employers, and how one thing can potentially influence the other.
Exactly. So what you can see here are an accumulation of the strongest association that we generally see tech companies having. So those are the green ones that you can see on the left. They're all around market success, embracing new technology, innovation, and being in creative environments. So everything that we normally associate the tech companies with. And the orange ones are the attributes that the general big tech in general tend to have a lower association with, and that's more around inspiring leadership, CSR, support for gender equality, and ethical standards. And when we looked into the data and compared and contrasted it over the past 3 years here in the UK, we actually saw a trend that some of these companies were losing in association when it came to these more softer and more purpose-related attributes, which we kind of discussed a little bit earlier in this webinar. So things like inspiring leadership, CSR, and support for gender equality, actually these companies have lost in association when it came to these particular attributes. But what is really interesting is when we look into the stronger association field, we also see that a number of these big tech organizations are actually losing in association there as well. And that brings us to try to analyze and try to find correlations between the two, right? And if you think about it, in today's society, if you're not associated with gender equality, if you're not actively talking about CSR and inspiring leadership, can you still be associated as a successful and big innovative company anymore? Or does these two, perhaps seemingly to some companies, maybe different areas of the business, actually correlate to a stronger business? And is this one of the reasons why we're seeing companies like Facebook, for example, losing a little bit because of they're losing out on the softer piece a little bit? What do you think, Steve, Dennis?
I have a thought. Yeah, I think the thing that jumps out to me is those factors that are on the right-hand side there, because they're human factors and because they are people factors. When we feel like the media and the world is telling us about all the weaknesses of an organization and the challenges that they are facing as an organization, we lose a little bit of trust, and we lose a little bit of human purposeful trust. So it's kind of an understanding that some of those purposeful elements will be dropped. And the challenge really, therefore, for the tech organizations like this is to consider that there are two audiences. One of them is us as consumers, as users, etc. And then to consider that talent audiences, whilst the same, the purpose of the conversation is different. And therefore, there has to be a correlation of understanding that what is done from a public-facing media world is not necessarily the same as what it's like inside the organization. And we all know, everybody knows, actually, if you stop to take the media away and then start to think about these sort of organizations that we're talking about, rather like Facebook, of course they do enormous amounts of works in CSR and gender equality and raising ethical standards. And actually, we know a lot of them to have quite inspiring leadership as well, and leaders that people do admire. So the irony really is that the companies have got these strengths. These are actually strengths of the organization. If we're going to be kind of advisory around this, we would say maybe they're just not getting that message in the eyes of accessible talent well enough. They're not overarching the message or balancing out the message with a really strong communication around what it feels, the initiatives to support gender equality, the initiatives to create a more purposeful, sustainable environment, etc. Because though that the opportunity is there for them to do it, because we know they do something about it, it's just the assumption in perception has been taken away by the broader world and the bigger challenges that organizations like this face. And it's understandable, and we have huge empathy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything?
Yeah, no, I just reiterate what you're saying. I mean, what we're looking here is associations, right? It's built on people's preconceived notions about what these companies actually stand for. But for these people, perception is reality, right? So it is really important for companies to really take a close look at their employee branding strategies and realize, or examine, are we really getting the topics across that we want to and that we know that people today want to hear about? And perhaps with some of these companies, we need to do a little bit of remodeling there of what they want to prioritize, right?
Absolutely. Cool. Super subject, really interesting subject. And to kind of follow it on a little bit really here, because as I alluded to earlier, sustainability is right in front of our mind as well at the moment. Again, if you revert back to the media and the things that are in front of our eyes right now, we're all becoming very aware of the need for climate change and sustainability. And one of the areas and where this is most prominent in our 2021 research was within tech talents. And so we want to look at some of the sort of trends that exist here that we've spotted. I mean, obviously, paint the scene, Carolina. I'll leave you to paint the scene on this.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to tech talent, we're usually very used to people talking about innovation, new technology, creative projects, but what we've all been hearing about over the past couple of weeks have obviously been very much colored about the UN climate change conference and all the implications that have had on environment and everything. And that has come to impact what tech talent and particularly want to hear about. And it's quite interesting because companies that traditionally have been focusing a lot on the conversation around innovation and tech, they subsequently have started to change the narrative as well. And it's a lot been driven by what we're seeing in media, right? Because everyone, we're sitting home, we're hearing this on the radio, we're seeing this on TV every day, and we're getting reminded that, hey, this is an actual problem, this is a real problem, and it's something that we need to do something about. So effectively, these issues that we're seeing is starting to affect what not only talent in general are looking for, but more specifically tech professionals are looking for, which is what we're going to look into over the next couple of slides here. So if we look into this data point here, what we can see is tech professionals' preferences, talent preferences over the past 4 years. And what we can see is things like innovation, access to new technology, and creative work environment, although it's still really important, it's still amongst the most important attributes for this particular target group, it has decreased in attractiveness over the past 4 years and leaving room for things like inspiring purpose, CSR, sustainability, and commitment to D&I to really increase. And also, if we move into the topics that these talent groups want to hear about, if we move to the next slide, we can see a similar pattern there. So these were the previous slide was looking at the attributes that they want to focus on, that they want to see in their employer. This is what topics that they want their future employers to talk about, right, in their media channels. And what we can see, it's a lot around obviously training opportunities, professional career development, and the salary piece, of course. But what is important is that D&I as well as CSR has actually, is amongst the top 10 most important topics. But if we look into the topics that have increased in importance over the past 18 months, we can actually see that CSR is the one thing that tech talent in particular want to hear more about, and quite closely followed by diversity and inclusion initiatives as well. So if you think about that, that changes the narrative and the focus in ways that we should communicate with the tech talent audience. Of course, they're still focused on innovation and technology, but it's not only talking about, hey, I'm producing the latest, coolest software, but it's more around, I'm producing the latest and coolest software that can have these following results and that can impact the world in certain ways. So if you look into that and how this has changed the ways that companies have started to communicate around the topic, we can actually, I had a bit of a research session when I looked into the top 5 companies that attracts IT professionals in our 2021 survey. And these are all the big tech companies that we're familiar with, Google, Apple, Microsoft, for example. But if we look into the career websites, obviously they're talking about innovation and innovation with a purpose, right? But what they have put a greater spin on is actually the sustainability piece. So you can see these posters on the career websites right now, talking about sustainability with Google, talking about the importance of being carbon neutral, or focusing on more sustainable solutions, right? And if we look at the bottom right corner here, and we focus a little bit more on Tesla, I say Tesla has probably been leading the way a little bit for the automation or for the automotive industry in terms of how they want to take the step in, or how they want to enter the world of being a more sustainable industry, right? And actually, if we move to the next slide here, the automotive industry have perhaps had a little bit of a history of being, associated with pollution, a lot of car, heavy industry. And Tesla last year opened a new manufacturing plant in Germany. So what we did is we wanted to see what impact Tesla had on our ranking and talent trends in Germany, right? So we actually entered a question that focused a little bit more on sustainability. So we basically asked the professional respondents in Germany, how important from a scale from 1 to 5 is sustainability for you when it comes to choosing a future employer? And what we can see here are the results, right? Because we matched those results with the employers that they saw being the most attractive, right? So any respondent that selected sustainability from a scale from 3 to 5, they actually chose Tesla as their most ideal employer compared to talent that ranked CSR as a 1 or 2. They instead prefer the more traditional automotive companies like Porsche, for example. And with these trends that we're seeing now, that more and more tech people are becoming increasingly more interested in the topics of sustainability, of being eco-friendly. This is something that the other automotive companies need to act on pretty soon, because otherwise, they're going to lose talent to other companies that have a more sustainable agenda, right? And already, although this is in Germany, if we bring it back to the UK, and we can see how some of the other automotive companies have started marketing themselves on their career websites here in the UK, we can see that it is still very, very influenced by the sustainability agenda here as well. You see Jaguar or Land Rover here, for example. What if cars made breathing easier, which is a very, very strong correlation to, previous assumptions with the automotive industry being a little bit of a polluting industry, right? And I think this is great, right? I think this is really, really positive, and it's really showcasing how companies can demonstrate how you can make an impact, how you can utilize your skills and abilities in a positive way that influences and impacts our society in a positive way moving forward. Anything, Dennis? I know you work a lot with some of these companies. Any thoughts around this?
I think, even more now when we're hosting this webinar, it became evident that how the automotive industry might differ from the tech industry is that the corporate brand or consumer brand and the employer brand in the automotive industry is really connected. The corporate brand and the consumer brand with the cars, etc., is really, really connected to the employer brand, with combining innovation with the softer values, with the purpose-driven values, etc. Whilst in the tech industry, when we look at the employer brand specifically, it tends to be related to the drivers where we saw that they're not associated with. So we might see CSR, gender equality. Really, the overarching purpose tends to be connecting people, right? But the corporate brand and the scandals that we might see and the reports that come out, it's not at all connected with that. So there's a disconnect. Whilst the automotive industry has positioned itself really, really well because the corporate and consumer brand supports the purpose piece really, really well. And even, if we look at the German slide that you had, we saw Tesla, obviously, for people that appreciated and valued sustainability, Tesla rose up. But if we think about it, all the car brands that were listed produce electric cars. So to some extent, the corporate brand supports it, but people won't forget. One of the employers that we saw at the bottom lied about the emission gas, etc. It was a big scandal, and clearly they're still suffering from that. So when you can really combine the corporate brand with the employer brand and tell the same story and walk the talk, you get excellent results like JLR, Rolls-Royce, McLaren, etc.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think something we just wanted to reiterate here as well is that big companies are not only focusing on the CSR piece as well. We're also seeing that they really double down on the other more purpose-related piece around being an accepting and inclusive employer, right? And I think a lot of us here on this call today have seen these examples, especially the one from Google around mental health and mental awareness. And then also Netflix is doing an amazing job in terms of promoting diverse talent and ensuring that they have an ethnically diverse talent force, right? Which I think is amazing. And then moving on to the next slide as well, here we can see Spotify with a really, really interesting or inspiring initiative on there and promoting mental health and awareness. They allow their employees 1 week off. They close their entire office, and we've seen other companies do that throughout the pandemic to make sure that they're walking the talk, right? They're showcasing that they truly care for their employees' well-being. They're not pushing them to the brink of burnout, but they're realizing that we have undergone a quite difficult 18 months. I'd say most of us are probably pretty tired of sitting at home and not meeting with our colleagues, which in many cases are our friends as well. So it's been a tough year, and for companies to really showcase that we realize this, we understand it, we value you beyond whatever commercial ability you can bring to the company is something that really, really stands out, and I think will increase in importance moving forward.
Yeah, and I think a big sort of little summary of that sort of section that we've just covered as well, going back to the slide 2, 3 back that looked at the fact that there are rising attributes and there are slightly falling attributes. It's not either or, and those falling attributes are still high on the agenda. The innovation, the development, the forward-thinking attributes, etc., still super high. But you used a phrase, whether accidentally or deliberately, Carolina, you used the phrase "making space" for other attributes to come to the fore. And actually, that's what it's about. It's not a case of innovation or sustainability, progression, or people. It's the two combined, and the companies that get their branding and employer branding just right innovate the need for development and excitement and innovation with the importance of the humans in the process and the purpose of the process as well. And when they get that right, as you start to see the car brand, I think the car brand's an amazing example of an industry that is having to adapt. And we saw it in our rankings as well. To go back to our recent research, car brands did really well in the UK this year, really good steps in the right direction. They're leading the way possibly in really innovating with purpose, from a place where, as you alluded to earlier, maybe they weren't necessarily always the greenest of industries. Now we're starting to see a whole shift, and that makes people feel good about working there, and that means they're more attractive to talent. And the two, it comes back to the fact that sometimes all our work publicly is absolutely aligned with our people goals as well. So really, really interesting stuff. So yes, to look and summarise a little bit, and then we'll answer a couple of questions that we've got here. Let's think about what we're going to do about this as organisations. I think it's always good to listen to these stories and understand the research, but I think it's really important to take research and understand what we're going to do about it. One of the things posed here was, how can you build the culture of trust inside your organisation? And just as importantly, communicate how you support employees both, and communicate this internally and externally. I think this is what's really important. One, try and understand trust. What does understand trust mean? What does trust stand for? Hopefully we've given a few ideas today, because trust is more than just the word trust. There are things, we talked about security, we talked about belonging, we talked about equality, and all those sort of things that engender trust. So there's a number of things to think about. And then how do you communicate that? Like I say, externally, which we always think about employer brand and recruitment communications quite a lot externally, but how do we reinforce internally? Because retention is a massive issue in this whole great resignation process. So therefore, we need to remind our people that we care for them and we're doing good things inside our organization. Do you understand your weaknesses and strengths in brand perception? How do you address it? Really important to recognize that you might have some areas that are you're not telling the best side of yourselves in that respect. But if it's something that talent needs, you need to work out a way in which to address it. So understand the differences, like we looked at the tech points there. One can impact the other. So be really conscious of where you are weak versus where you are strong, and look at it. Requires a bit of data, but that's where we come in. And given the rise and the importance of purpose-driven employers in 2021 and the views of talent, how do you display your best side? As we alluded to earlier, there aren't many organizations out there now. I don't think anybody we ever talk to isn't trying to address equality. They're all trying to address sustainability, etc., etc. We're all trying to do the work, and we're all swimming in the same lane in that respect. How do we show that best side best, and how do we make it unique to who we are as organizations? That's the bit to kind of look at when we think about employer brand and best kind of communications. Those things need to be aligned to a number of other things to be successful in employer branding, but how do you display those best sides to stand apart? That's the most important thing. So look, let me, I've got some questions that have come through that I want to kind of cover here. First one that is asked is, interesting that flexible working is less attractive. Is that because it's more of a given now? We alluded to this, and actually I think Carolina covered this quite well by stating that point, that actually it isn't quite so much of a point of difference any longer. It's kind of almost, it's not as simple as it's taken as a given, but is no longer a unique point that people will say, hey, we're a flexible working environment, because that's kind of a more common feature of an organization now, and therefore probably something that people don't feel as though they need to look deeply into to get a feel as though whether that's going to be a driver as to why they want to work for a company. Anything else to add on that, Dennis and Carolina? Was that covered it, do you think?
No, I think you're spot on. The only thing I would say is it's when you go granular and look into this driver, we do see some differences. So in the overarching UK survey for students and professionals, it tend to decline because it's given. But when we zoom into females within the ethnic minority population, or just the ethnic minority population overall, it's still very highly rated, which we'll cover in another webinar. So thinking about how biases and privileges might come into play will definitely be a factor within this. But other than that, overall, I definitely echo your point.
Great point. Yeah, really true. Very true. Second question here. The Great Resignation is hitting us hard right now. What do you advise we should focus on first with our employer brand to solve the challenge of difficult retention and low application flow? And I think this is fair. I think any thoughts, because I think there is a feeling, I know from conversations right now, and I'm sure you guys do, around the fact that this is a now problem. And yes, we've got a medium-term problem. There's also a bit of a now problem to deal with. Any advice from you guys? I've got a couple of thoughts, but
yeah, I think
a couple of thoughts.
No, I think generally when we talk about employer brand, I think it's important to remember that trust is not something that is bought. It's something that's earned over time, and it takes dedication, it takes commitment, and it takes you going through perhaps a little bit of a rough period as an organization to understand that these values that we have, we stand by them, whether things are good or bad, right? So I think from a long-term perspective, I think having an employer brand will really help organizations. And that's what we've seen throughout the pandemic, that companies that have communicated throughout the pandemic, who've had that strong employer brand to rely on, have in general tend to fare a little bit better, perhaps the companies that haven't, right? But that's perhaps a little bit more of a long-term solution rather than a what do we do now.
It is, and I think and again, one of the conversations that we have quite a lot is that, the whole what do we do now? We can't, because you're absolutely right. It's like it has to be something sustainable. There has to be employer brand piece has to be something that's sustainable. But right now, whilst we've not set the theme for our future organization always just yet, because we haven't gone through that process of really working out, at the same time as well, quite quickly and quite easily, you can find some truths inside the organization. Pick up some truths and stories inside the organization. Get a filming company, contact us and get a filming company in for a day and find some stories and find some really great things inside the business and use that in targeted recruitment marketing. Get people thinking about your organization in their brains, in their mobile phones, in their, and start to understand that you still need very employer brand positive story methodology rather than just throwing it into the obvious places. You need to find, so there are some short-term fixes. There are always some short-term fixes you can do, but you're absolutely right, Caroline. There needs to be some sort of fundamental structure built in order to make sure that we are going to hold people better in the future and attract people better in the future. And one more question. What if we don't have a sustainability story to tell? If the business isn't there yet, any thoughts on that? If the business isn't really a sustainable business yet, what story do you feel we can tell?
I think that's, one point of mention is that CSR obviously increasing in importance and then featuring there. It's not the only thing of importance, right? Tell the stories that you can tell. If you're offering embracing tech, a sustainable people strategy, etc., tell those truths. But I would also say, and this goes into D&I strategies as well, rather be transparent where you are and where you're trying to get. Be updating that strategy quarterly, monthly, annually, whatever it might be, but give a window to look into. Say, hey, we're not the best within CSR currently. We're looking for the people to change that. We're currently having these initiatives to change that, and we're working on it, but we're a work in progress. People don't necessarily expect you to be the number one company within this, right? They don't expect you to single-handedly save the world, but if you're doing something and want people to join you at that journey, that could be quite powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree 100% with everything Dennis said.
It's the best thing I ever said.
Yeah.
We're all in agreement then. This is nice. No, absolutely. Play to your strengths. I think that's the absolute thing. And I like the transparency idea, Dennis. I think that's one of those things that companies struggle with a little bit sometimes, but very understandably as well. There's a fear, isn't there? But I don't think it's easy for sustainability to be fixed easily by organizations, like you say. So I think play to your strengths, tell people about your dreams and aspirations as an organization. I think that's something quite attractive about that, and a characteristic in any case. So, well, look, thanks, guys. Thanks for that, all your insights and deep analysis of some of the stuff that we're finding. I mean, goodness, like everybody, we've only touched the surface of what the insights are there inside our Universum treasure chest. Look, there's more. If you want to find out more, there are our contact details that have been sitting on the page for a little while, in case you want to get in contact with us about any of those things that are on the screen. We will certainly be happy to chat through any of those things. But thanks to everyone for joining us, whether it's live or watching the recording afterwards. And thank you to Carolina and Dennis for your amazing insights and awesome input today. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.